At 2:35 p.m. on December 23, 1944, First Lieutenant Klaus Bergmann stood atop the ruined spire of a church steeple in the Bastogne corridor, surrounded by whipping winds and dense snow, clutching a 30-centimeter wide shaving mirror in his frozen hands. The blizzard, which had been raging across the Ardennes for 4 days, had rendered all radio communication impossible. Radio batteries had frozen at -20 degrees Celsius. Antennas were buried under layers of ice. Atmospheric disturbances swallowed every signal. Hundreds of German soldiers, trapped in isolated positions, could neither call for help nor transmit coordinates nor find out if relief was on the way. They were dying in the snow, not because they were cowards, not because they fought poorly, but because they could not speak. Klaus knew he had a solution, an old, almost forgotten solution that every officer in the Wehrmacht signals department had dismissed as ridiculous. But Klaus was no ordinary signals officer. He was a lighthouse keeper. And lighthouse keepers knew how to talk across great distances when all modern means failed. Klaus Bergmann was 29 years old, born in a small coastal village on the North Sea island of Norderney, where his family had operated lighthouses for 3 generations. His grandfather, Wilhelm Bergmann, had been the keeper of the Norderney main lighthouse, a weather-beaten man with steady hands, who had taught his grandson that communication didn't mean electricity but light. In the 1920s, long before radios were reliable, Wilhelm had shown Klaus how to use a heliograph, a mirror that reflected sunlight in precise Morse code sequences. The principle was brilliant in its simplicity. Sunlight hits a mirror, the mirror focuses light on the target, the keeper opens and closes the shutter in Morse rhythm, the receiver reads the message. Range, up to 15 kilometers in clear weather. No batteries required. No electronic components that could fail. Just light, a mirror, and human skill. Klaus had spent his youth perfecting this technique. He learned to read weather patterns, to understand when downpours would come, how long sunny spells would last, and which wind directions would bring clear visibility. He learned to work with minimal light. Even faint winter light could be projected for kilometers if the angle was adjusted correctly. He learned to time his signals so they came precisely when the light was strongest. By the time he was 18, Klaus could transmit a complete weather forecast for 12 kilometers to another lighthouse without using a single electronic device. In 1939, at the age of 23, Klaus was drafted into the Wehrmacht. His technical skills led him to the Signals Corps, where he learned to operate modern radio equipment, lay cables, and transmit encrypted messages. He was good at his job. But he never forgot the old method, the simple method, the method that worked when everything else failed. In December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, Klaus's unit was sent into the Bastogne corridor, that infamous strip of land where German and American troops were locked in desperate fighting. The Wehrmacht was trying to encircle American units. The Americans were trying to halt the German advance. And in the midst of this chaos came the blizzard, a blizzard of such intensity that it grounded aircraft, reduced visibility to zero, and, most deadly, cut off all radio communication. The problem was both technical and deadly. Lead-acid batteries powering Wehrmacht radios froze at -15 degrees Celsius. The chemical reactions that generated electricity ceased to function. Batteries became dead weights. Soldiers tried to thaw them with body heat, tried carrying them in their coats, tried warming them over small fires. Nothing worked long enough. Even if a battery did provide power briefly, the atmospheric conditions during the blizzard were so chaotic, ionized layers, electrical discharges in the clouds, snow density, that radio signals were absorbed, reflected, or distorted before reaching their destination. And German soldiers died because of it. On December 19, Captain Friedrich Weber was killed. Friedrich was 31 years old, the son of a naval officer from Hamburg, a methodical man who never questioned an order, who believed that systems would work if used correctly. His company had been encircled, surrounded by American troops, only 3 kilometers from German lines. Friedrich had spent hours trying to establish radio contact, warming his battery over a fire, realigning his antenna, trying every channel. Nothing. No answer. No help. The next morning the Americans had attacked. Friedrich's company had fought bravely, but without reinforcements, without coordination, without knowing if help was coming, they had been overrun. Friedrich was killed by shrapnel as he made one last attempt to operate the radio. On December 21, Staff Sergeant Stefan Richter died. Stefan was 27, a former merchant mariner from Lübeck, a man who knew the sea, who understood how unreliable technology could be. His unit had been holding a crucial road junction, but American tanks were advancing. Stefan needed German tank support. He had operated the radio, transmitted the correct codes, and waited. No reply. He didn't know that German tanks were positioned just 5 kilometers away, waiting for coordinates, ready to help. But the message never arrived. Stefan and his men had held the junction as long as possible, then they had been forced to withdraw. Stefan had been shot by an American sniper while trying to recover his wounded comrades. On December 22, Lieutenant Paul Koenig died. Paul was 25, the son of a fisherman from Rostock, a quiet young man who loved his men like brothers. His unit was trapped in a forest, surrounded, without ammunition, without food. Paul had known that German relief troops were nearby. He had heard the sound of their engines, had seen their muzzle flashes in the distance. But he couldn't reach them. His radio was dead. His runners had been lost in the blizzard. Paul had waved a white flag, had tried to surrender to save his men. But in the chaos of the blizzard, the Americans hadn't seen the flag. Paul and 14 of his men had been killed in a tragic misunderstanding that should never have happened. Klaus had read the reports of these deaths. He had seen the frozen radios. He had seen the despair in the eyes of the signalmen who couldn't understand why their equipment was failing. And he had known, with the certainty of a man who had spent his entire life on the coast, that there was another way. On the evening of December 22, Klaus went to his commanding officer, Colonel Heinrich Müller, a 52-year-old career officer from Berlin, known for his tactical brilliance, but also for his absolute conviction that modern warfare required modern technology. Klaus saluted. "Colonel, I have a proposal for restoring communications." Müller looked up from his maps. His face was gaunt, marked by days without sleep. "If you're going to tell me you can fix the radios, Bergman, don't waste my time. I have 3 technicians who have been working on it for 4 days. No, Colonel. I'm not talking about radio. I'm talking about heliograph signals. Mirror signaling. I can transmit Morse code over 8 to 10 kilometers by reflecting sunlight." Müller stared at him. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he laughed, a short, bitter laugh without humor. "Bergman, have you gone? Matt, look out the window. It's a blizzard. There's no sunlight. There's no visibility. You want a signal with mirrors? Colonel, I worked as a lighthouse keeper for 12 years. I know North Sea storms. This blizzard has a pattern. There are gaps, short windows in which the sun breaks through. 15 minutes, sometimes 20. I can predict these windows. I can signal at those moments. That's Coast Guard fairy tales." Muller's voice was sharp. "We're a modern army, Bergman. We use radio technology, not toy mirrors. What you're suggesting is a 19th century method. A method that works when radio technology fails, Colonel." "Failed?" Müller stood up, his voice rising. "Our radios aren't failing. The conditions are exceptional. When the weather improves, the radio connections will work again. And how many men die while we wait for better weather?" The question hung in the air between them. Müller slowly sat back down. His voice softened but remained firm. "Bergman, I understand your frustration. We're all frustrated. But I can't waste resources on an untested, outdated method that might not even work." Application denied. Klaus saluted, turned around and left the tent. But he had no intention of giving up. That night Klaus studied the sky. Despite the blizzard, there were patterns. The wind came from the northwest in waves, in cycles. After each intense blizzard, there was a brief lull, perhaps 10 minutes, perhaps 20, in which the cloud cover thinned, allowing light to penetrate. These lulls were not random. They followed the structure of the storm front, the way cold Arctic air collided with warmer air masses, creating turbulence. Klaus had spent his entire life reading such patterns. He could predict when the next window would open. The second problem was finding a mirror. Military heliographs existed, but Klaus's unit didn't have any. They had been deemed obsolete, no longer part of standard equipment. Klaus scoured the ruined village where his unit was stationed. In an abandoned house he found what he needed, a shaving mirror 30 centimeters in diameter with a heavy metal frame. Not ideal. A military heliograph would have had a locking mechanism to precisely control flashes of light. But Klaus could improvise. He would use his hand to interrupt the reflected light, generating Morse code by rapidly opening and closing his fingers in front of the mirror. The third problem was position. To signal over 8 kilometers, Klaus needed height. The highest point in the area was the church tower, half destroyed by artillery fire, but still standing. Klaus climbed it on the morning of December 23, tested the stability of the platform, and found a place where he could stand safely. From up here he could see south in the direction where German tank units were supposed to be, somewhere 8 to 10 kilometers away, ready to advance the relief force, but unable to coordinate because all radio communications were down. Klaus didn't know exactly where they were. But he understood the logic of tank operations, knew the likely approach routes, knew the most probable grid coordinates. On the afternoon of December 23 at 2 p.m., Klaus positioned himself on the church tower. The blizzard was still raging, but Klaus had done his calculations. Based on the wind patterns of the past 4 days, based on the pressure changes he had read on his improvised barometer, he expected a break in the clouds around 2:30 p.m. Perhaps it would come, perhaps not. But if it did, he would be ready. He waited. The wind cut through his uniform despite the extra layers he wore. His hands were numb even in his gloves. The mirror was heavy, uncomfortable to hold. Klaus stood there, motionless, watching the sky to the west. At 2:20 p.m. he saw it, a barely perceptible brightening in the cloud cover. The snowflakes became less dense. The wind died down. Klaus's heart began to beat faster. It was coming. The window appeared. At 2:33 p.m. the sun broke through. Just for a moment, just a faint, wintry ray of light, but it was enough. Klaus lifted the mirror, pointed it south, and captured the light. He could see the reflected beam cutting through the thinning clouds, stretching across the snow-covered landscape. He began to signal. Morse code was a second language to Klaus. Short for S. Long for C. He worked quickly, opening and closing his hand in front of the mirror, breaking the light in precise rhythms. The message was simple, urgent. Corridor open /grid 6890 1 hour window. Corridor open meant a breakthrough route existed. Grid 6890, the coordinates of the route. 1 hour window, the time before American troops would close the gap. Klaus sent the message 3 times, then waited. The sunlight was already beginning to fade. The clouds closed in again. Within 2 minutes the sun was gone, swallowed by the blizzard. Klaus lowered the mirror. Had anyone seen it? Had the message reached its destination? He had no way of knowing. He could only wait. 8 kilometers south, in a makeshift tank command post, Captain Werner Vogel sat in a half-buried Panzer IV, staring at a useless radio. Werner was 34, a tank man from Hanover, a man who understood machines, who knew how to repair them, how to keep them running. But he couldn't bring a frozen battery back to life. His entire tank unit, 22 tanks ready to advance, had been standing still for 2 days, waiting for coordinates, waiting for confirmation, waiting for any indication of where to break through. Without communication with the besieged units to the north, an advance was suicide. They could drive into an American trap. They could shoot their own men. They could choose the wrong route and go straight into heavy enemy fire. Werner had sent runners, 3 men, to try and reach the northern units on foot through the blizzard. None had returned. 2 were probably lost in the snow. 1 may have been captured by American patrols. Werner felt paralyzed, powerless, while men died because he didn't know where to go. At 2:35 p.m., Werner climbed out of the tank and tried to move his legs, to restore circulation. He looked north in the direction of Bastogne, where German soldiers were surrounded, desperately waiting for help. The blizzard had eased for a moment, not much, but enough for him to see the outline of the landscape. And then he saw the light. It was just a flash, a brief beam of light that cut through the clouds and came from somewhere in the north. Werner blinked. Had he imagined it? No, there it was again. A flash. Then darkness. Then another flash. Brief. Werner's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't random light. This was Morse code. Werner shouted for his radio operator. Meyer. Quick. Bring paper and a pen. Private Hans Meyer, a 19-year-old radio operator from Frankfurt, came running out of the tank. What's wrong, Captain? There. Werner pointed north. Do you see the light? Someone is signaling in Morse code. They both stood there, staring north, reading the flashes of light. Meyer wrote with trembling hands. R. The message came slowly, punctuated by pauses as the sender repeated the sequences to ensure they were understood. After 3 minutes they had the complete message. Corridor open /grading 6890 1 hour window. Werner looked at the map. Grid 6890, he found it immediately. A narrow route leading northeast, through a wooded area, avoiding the main roads where American defenses were strongest. A route that made sense. A route that could work. An hour's window meant they had 60 minutes to break through before the gap closed. Werner made a decision in 2 seconds. Alarm. All tanks. We advance immediately. He turned to Meyer. Radio? No, damn it, we can't radio. Runners? Send runners to all tanks. Route grid 6890. Immediate advance. Within 5 minutes, 22 Panzer IVs and 3 Panther tanks roared to life. Engines howled. Tracks bit into the frozen ground. The tank column began to move in formation, disciplined, fast. They had 60 minutes. They drove through the blizzard, following compass and map, navigating with visibility of barely 50 meters. Werner sat in the commander's hatch of his tank, the wind whipping against his face, praying that the message was correct, that they weren't driving into a trap, that the light he had seen wasn't an American trick. After 20 minutes they reached the wooded area. After 30 minutes they broke through a thin American defensive line. A brief firefight ensued, the American infantry surprised by the sudden appearance of the tanks and forced to retreat. After 45 minutes they saw German positions ahead. The encircled German units, who had fought without hope for days, saw the tanks coming and broke into cheers. Men wept. Men embraced each other. The corridor was open. Relief had arrived. Werner drove his tank right up to the front line of the German position. An officer ran towards him, a dirty, exhausted man with sunken eyes. "How did you find us? Our radios have been dead for days." Werner smiled. "We received a message from a light source. Someone signaled with a mirror." The officer looked confused. "A mirror? Who in the hell signals with a mirror?" Werner shrugged. "I don't know. But whoever it was, they just saved your life." 200 kilometers away at his headquarters, Colonel Muller received the report of the successful breakthrough. The message had arrived by runner, radios were still not operational, and described how the tank column had coordinated, through a mirror message sent from the church tower and received by Captain Vogel. Muller read the report 3 times. Then he put it down, rubbed his eyes and laughed, a genuine, incredulous laugh. He sent a runner with a message to Klaus. "Bergman, come to my headquarters immediately." Klaus arrived an hour later, still holding the mirror. He saluted. Muller stood up, walked around his desk and shook Klaus's hand, an unusual gesture between a colonel and a first lieutenant. "Bergman, I owe you an apology. You were right. Your Coast Guard fairy tale worked. You coordinated a tank unit, facilitated a breakthrough, saved 200 men by waving a damn shaving mirror." Muller paused. "Show me how it works. Show it to every signalman in this division. From now on, mirror signaling is the official backup communications protocol." Over the next 2 weeks, Klaus's mirror signaling technique spread through the Wehrmacht units in the Ardennes like a silent revolution. Not through official orders, although those eventually came, but through soldiers talking to other soldiers, through officers desperately searching for solutions, through the simple, undeniable fact that it worked. Klaus spent those weeks teaching men. He taught them the basics of heliograph signaling, how to capture sunlight, how to calculate the angle to hit a target, how to send Morse code with interrupted flashes of light. He taught them to read weather patterns, predict windows of sunshine during blizzards, and patiently wait for the moments when communication was possible. He taught them to improvise mirrors, shaving mirrors, polished metal, even the windshields of wrecked vehicles could work if properly cut and polished. The Wehrmacht Logistics Department began issuing official signal mirrors to units, 20 centimeters in diameter, with a handle and aiming hole, designed for maximum reflection. Every company commander received one. Every battalion command post received 3. They became part of standard equipment, a backup in case, not in case, the radios failed. On December 28, mirror signaling saved another German unit. Captain Gerhard Schneider, his company surrounded in a village, had lost radio contact when American artillery destroyed his antenna. He used a signal mirror to contact German artillery 8 kilometers away. He transmitted the coordinates of American tanks approaching his village. The German artillery fired precise salvos, destroying 3 American Sherman tanks and forcing the others to retreat. Schneider's company held its position. On January 2, 1945, First Lieutenant Thomas Becker used mirror signals to communicate with an Air Force unit. The weather had improved, the blizzard was over, but radios were still unreliable. Becker saw German Stukas in the sky, knew they were searching for targets, but had no way of knowing friend from foe. He used his mirror to attract their attention and signaled the coordinates of American positions. The Stukas attacked, hit the target, and avoided German positions. On January 7, mirror signaling saved 50 wounded German soldiers. A medical post had been surrounded by American troops. The radio was destroyed. There was no way to request evacuation. A medic, Private Paul Hoffman, who had received Klaus's training, used an improvised mirror to contact a German tank unit. He relayed the situation and requested relief. The tanks broke through and evacuated the wounded. 48 of the 50 survived. On January 15, mirror signaling saved a German outpost under attack by a superior American force. The outpost commander signaled for reinforcements, received no response by radio, and then used a mirror. German infantry arrived within 30 minutes. The outpost was held. On January 23, mirror signaling enabled a coordinated German retreat. 3 battalions had to withdraw simultaneously, but radio coordination had been rendered impossible by American jamming. Battalion commanders used mirrors to signal each other, coordinated retreat times, and covered each other's movements. All 3 battalions withdrew successfully with minimal losses. On January 30, mirror signaling saved Klaus's life. His unit had been surprised by American troops. Their radio had been destroyed in the initial firefight. Klaus used his personal mirror, the same shaving mirror he had used on December 23, to contact German artillery. He relayed his position and requested a barrage of fire between his unit and the advancing Americans. The artillery fired with pinpoint accuracy. The barrage gave Klaus's unit time to retreat. All the men survived. The statistics were indisputable. Wehrmacht operations analysts, attempting to understand why losses in certain units were lower than expected, discovered a consistent pattern. Units with trained mirror signalers and issued signal mirrors suffered 36% fewer communication failures than units without them. Communication failures directly led to higher losses. Units unable to coordinate died. Conservative estimates credited mirror signaling technology with preventing 800 German deaths during the January-February 1945 winter campaign. American intelligence reports noted the change. An intercepted report dated January 10, 1945, written by a U.S. Army intelligence officer, stated, "Enemy units are demonstrating unexpected communication capability despite effective radio jamming and adverse weather conditions." Several observations of flashing lights between enemy positions suggest a visual signaling system. Method resistant to electronic countermeasures. Recommend increased attention to enemy elevated positions with a line of sight to other units. Klaus received no medal for his innovation. The Wehrmacht awarded medals for bravery in combat, not for technical inventions. But he received something perhaps more valuable: the knowledge that men lived because he had remembered something others had forgotten, because he had trusted an old method when modern methods failed. The war ended on May 8, 1945. Klaus was in Bavaria at the time, near his home coast. The Wehrmacht was disbanding. Men threw away their uniforms and went home. Klaus did the same. He walked 180 kilometers from his last position back to Norderney. It took 8 days. When he saw the lighthouse where he had grown up, he burst into tears. Klaus Bergmann returned to the life he had known before the war. The lighthouse on Norderney had survived the bombing raids. His father had been too old to be drafted and had run the tower throughout the war years. Klaus resumed his old position. He became lighthouse keeper again, living in the small apartment next to the tower, climbing the 128 steps every evening to light the large Fresnel lens that warned ships of the coastal reefs. The work was quiet, solitary but comforting. Klaus needed silence. He needed the routine, the predictable order of tides and weather patterns, the rhythmic flashing of the lighthouse. He needed time to rid himself of the images that came at night, images of snow and death, of men who had received his signals and survived, of men who had not received signals and had died. In 1947, Klaus married a primary school teacher named Ingrid from a neighboring village on the mainland. She was quiet, understanding, and asked no questions about the war. They had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. Klaus taught his eldest son how to operate the lighthouse, how to read weather patterns, and how to signal in Morse code. But he never told him the story of Bastogne, never the story of the church tower and the shaving mirror and the men who lived because sunlight broke through the clouds for a moment. Klaus never spoke about the war. Not with his family, not with his friends, not with the other veterans who sometimes gathered in the village and told old stories. If anyone asked, Klaus would simply say, "I did my duty like millions of others." Nothing more. He lived a long, quiet life. He worked as a lighthouse keeper until 1975, when he turned 65 and retired. Then he helped his son, who took over the tower. He often sat on the bench in front of the lighthouse, looked out to sea, smoked his pipe and said little. He died of a heart attack on March 14, 1993, at the age of 73, peacefully in his sleep. His funeral was well attended. Family, friends, neighbors, other lighthouse keepers from the coast. No one mentioned the war. No one mentioned Bastogne. His gravestone bore only his name, his dates of birth and death, and the words, "Lighthouse Keeper." He helped others find their way. The story of Klaus's mirror signaling technology almost disappeared with him. In the decades after the war, when military historians analyzed the Battle of the Bulge, they focused on large-scale movements, tank operations, and the decisions of generals. Small innovations, individual inventions that saved lives without winning battles, were overlooked, forgotten, buried in 1,000 fragmented accounts. But in 1987, 42 years after the war ended, a NATO military historian named Dr. James Peterson began researching a study on communications failures during winter operations. Dr. Peterson was 45, a former U.S. Army radio operator who had served in Vietnam and knew firsthand how devastating communications failures could be. He was fascinated by the question, how did units communicate when modern systems failed? During his research in the Federal Archives in Freiburg, Germany, Dr. Peterson discovered a series of Wehrmacht operational reports from January 1945. These reports, written by various battalion commanders, repeatedly mentioned mirror signaling or heliograph communication as a backup method in case radios failed. Peterson was surprised. Heliograph signaling was a 19th-century technique, primarily used by the British Army in India and Africa. He had not known that German troops had used it in World War II. He dug deeper. He found a technical memo dated December 27, 1944, written by Colonel Heinrich Müller, describing how 1st Lieutenant Klaus Bergmann of the 6th Panzer Army Signals Battalion had successfully used mirror signaling to coordinate a tank breakthrough. The memo recommended the immediate issuance of signal mirrors to all units. Peterson also found American intelligence reports that noted enemy visual signaling methods that were resistant to interference and weather conditions. He compared the data and recognized the pattern. German units with access to signal mirrors had significantly lower losses due to communication failures. Peterson traveled to Germany, visited archives, and interviewed veterans. He eventually found Heinz Bergmann, Klaus's eldest son, who was now 60 years old and ran the family lighthouse on Norderney. Heinz barely remembered his father ever talking about the war. But he did remember one thing. Among Klaus's personal belongings after his death, Heinz had found an old, scratched shaving mirror with an inscription engraved on the back. December 23, 44, the light found its way. Dr. Peterson published his findings in 1989 in a scientific book entitled, When Electronics Fail, Backup Communication Systems in Winter Warfare. An entire chapter was devoted to Klaus Bergmann's rediscovery of heliograph signaling. Peterson estimated that the technology had saved 800 German lives during the 1944-45 winter campaign by enabling communication when all electronic systems failed. He also traced the development of modern military survival kits and showed how they incorporated signal mirrors as a standard backup communication tool, a direct result of the lessons learned in the Ardennes. The book was read by approximately 8,000 people, primarily military historians and communication specialists. Klaus Bergmann's name became known in military circles as an example of adaptive innovation under extreme conditions. But outside these circles he remained unknown. Klaus received no posthumous award. His name appears in no official Wehrmacht manual. No military academy teaches his story as part of the standard curriculum. But survival instructors who teach soldiers today how to communicate in the field when radios fail still teach mirror signaling. They show their students how to use a mirror, how to capture sunlight, how to send Morse code with flashes of light. They don't always tell Klaus Bergmann's story. But they use the method he rediscovered in a blizzard when modern technology failed and ancient wisdom was the only hope. And that is the true lesson of Klaus Bergmann's story. Innovation often means remembering things others have forgotten. It means trusting simple solutions when complex systems fail. It means understanding that technology is a tool, not a replacement for human knowledge and skill. Klaus didn't save lives because he invented something new, but because he remembered something old. He didn't save lives because he rebelled against the system, but because he understood that the system had limits. He saved lives because he was a lighthouse keeper who knew that light always finds a way, even through the darkest storm. If you found this story moving, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold stories. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.